Well, thank you to the Humanist community for inviting me to come speak on my favorite topic, climate change. I lead a group of Citizens Climate Lobby, and we actually meet here once a month. It's complicated. It's the Tuesday following the second Saturday of every month at 7 p.m. here. So hopefully you don't need a degree from MIT to figure that out. So today I want to jump into my talk. As the title suggests, I will talk about the basic science of climate change, and I think that hopefully I'll dispel any doubt in your mind about that this is basic science, this is real, there should be no doubt about that this is happening. And then I'll talk about what I consider to be a very effective proposal to combat climate change. So, yeah, there we go. It worked earlier.
How's that problem?
Yeah, I always test everything before I do. Oh, something is wrong with my computer. Here we go. Okay, there we go. Okay. So we call it the greenhouse effect because this is exactly how greenhouses work. So you can grow tomatoes in the middle of winter in a greenhouse without a source of heat from electricity or burning coal or wood or anything. And it's just really basic physics. What happens is, and the laser doesn't work here, so I have this pointer. What happens is the sun's light emits different wavelengths of light. It emits infrared light, it emits near infrared, and then it emits visible light. So glass, of course, we use because it's clear. So visible light will go through and you can see through the glass, but it turns out that what creates the warmth in a greenhouse is that the infrared does not go through the glass. So it bounces right off of the glass here. So when you have visible light going through, you have energy going through. As it bounces around inside the greenhouse, here's visible light, near infrared, as it bounces around, it turns into a cooler form of energy, infrared. That infrared cannot get out. So it bounces around, warming the greenhouse. So you have light energy that comes in through visible, converts to infrared. The infrared can't get out, and so the greenhouse gets warmer. And you'll see the same thing in the winter, when on a cold, sunny day, you go out to your car, and your car is warm, magically. And that's the greenhouse effect operating there. So, okay, so I'm going to demonstrate the physics behind it. My lovely assistant here, Jim, has this...
You're going to need to turn the image on.
Okay, all right. Of course, these things always lock. So the camera's on? Yeah. It'll come on shortly. There we go. So this camera here, this attachment to my Android phone, is an infrared camera. It only looks at that light that we can't see. It's the heat. And so what'll happen is I'll demonstrate with a piece of plastic here, which acts just like glass. And so Jim here is going to look at my face, and you can see, you can probably see that my face is bright here. And then as I put this plastic in front of my face, you can see that my face disappears. Okay? But you can still see me through this. But what happens is the heat from my body is not going through this plastic, or if it were glass, it would be the same thing. So you're seeing, so what will happen is I have a lot of slides to go through. I'll be here afterwards. You can play with the camera and you can try it for yourself. But you'll see that as I put this, you can see me perfectly fine through visible light through this, but the infrared is blocked. And that's how the greenhouse effect works. So, so it turns out that I have a question for you. What is the closest planet to the sun?
Mercury.
Mercury. But what is the hottest planet? Venus. How could that be? Venus is twice as far from the sun, and yet it's hotter. It's greenhouse effect. It's because Mercury has no atmosphere. It's not trapping any of that heat. Whereas Venus has a carbon dioxide atmosphere. And that is one of the threats. We could turn into sort of a carbon dioxide planet. So this is basic physics here that shows how that works. So the sun emits, as you heat up a piece of metal, as you heat it hot, first it's dull red, then it gets a brighter red, and then it goes yellow, and then it gets white hot. So that's called black body radiation. The temperature changes the colors change based on the temperature. So the sunlight comes in this band. That's the energy, this big curve up here. That's what comes from the sun. And you can see that we have evolved that our eyes respond to the biggest amount of energy coming back. This is the wavelength of light, or the color. And you can see that the visible is in this peak area. So we've evolved to adopt to see that visible light. Now, as that energy comes and hits the Earth, it turns into infrared. And the Earth is cooler than the sun, so the Earth actually emits in these bands, depending on what temperature you want to. So this is what the Earth is emitting. Now, what's inside this band here is what actually reaches the surface. So you have all these gases in the atmosphere that absorb this energy at different wavelengths. So this is what the sun is emitting at the top of the atmosphere, and these little things, you can see there's chunks taken out where different molecules in the atmosphere absorb that energy. So this is the energy that hits the Earth, and then this is what gets emitted back. And this blue is what gets out. So you can see here a lot more energy arrives on the Earth than what gets out. And it turns out that carbon dioxide absorbs in these wavelengths. So it absorbs quite strongly in the infrared. And that's the greenhouse effect. So I know it's complicated, but that's the physics that some people are unwilling to accept. So again, we've been burning fossil fuels for 150 years. So now all these molecules of carbon dioxide have gone into the atmosphere, and they've basically created a blanket. Oh, I keep forgetting the laser doesn't work. So we've created a blanket over the Earth that is now trapping that infrared that's trying to get out. So that infrared gets reflected back, and the planet gets hotter and hotter. So now, how much energy is actually being captured by this extra CO2 that we've put in the atmosphere? Well, it turns out it's the equivalent of 4 Hiroshima bombs going off every second. So over the day, you've got 345,000 Hiroshima bombs worth of energy being trapped on the planet. Now that would raise the temperature substantially, but 90% of that energy has been absorbed by the oceans. And so the ocean temperatures are rising, and that fuels the strength of hurricanes. So I'll show you some slides later, but the sea surface temperature in the oceans gives hurricanes the energy to make them stronger and stronger. So, if you think, just while I've been talking, how many hundreds of Hiroshima bombs worth of energy have gone off. So now another piece of information that scientists have gathered is by going back in time. It turns out in Antarctica, the snow never melts. So every year they get more snow, it keeps piling on top of itself, and the snow is now 2 miles thick. So if you drill into that snow, you can go back in time almost 1 million years. And that's what these people have done. These researchers are in Antarctica, and they've extracted these ice cores. And it turns out that you can see, just like tree rings, there are layers in here. And opposite of tree rings, you get the widest bands in the wintertime when you get the most snow, and then you still get some snow in the summertime, just like trees grow in the wintertime a little bit, but they grow slower, and so you get that dark band of wood in the tree. So here you can see 11 years of history, and now what happens is snow is light and fluffy, and it traps air in the snow, but as it piles up, getting a mile thick, it's very heavy, and it compacts that into ice. And in that ice, that air gets trapped, and you have these little bubbles of air that are trapped in there. And scientists have been able to extract the CO2 levels from those bubbles, and they can tell what the CO2 levels were a million years ago. Now, it's interesting, it's more complicated than that, but you can look at the isotopes of oxygen, oxygen 16 and 18, and the ratios tell you what temperature it was. So you can actually correlate temperature to CO2 levels, and that's what this next slide shows. There we go. Okay. Come on. All right. So what happens is, this is today, and this is going back in time. And this bottom graph is the CO2 levels, and the middle graph is temperature, and this is methane. So you can see these graphs look very similar to each other. When the CO2 levels were high, the temperatures were high. And you can see, and this is over multiple ice ages. So all of these lower parts were basically ice ages that happened. And then these are interglacials, the high parts. So you can see when CO2 levels were high, the temperature was high. Now the scary part, and this was in Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, which really got me activated on climate, was that CO2 levels have never been above, say, 290 parts per million. We are now at 410 parts per million. So we're off the scale in terms of the last, say, 13 ice ages. Okay? So it's hard to imagine what's going to happen to the planet when we're that far off from where we knew that Earth could pretty easily recover from ice ages, but now we don't really know what the Earth is going to do. Now here's another version of that same graph. This just shows CO2 levels. And this last part is where we've been starting to measure the CO2 directly. We're not using, sort of a proxy. We're not going back in ice cores. So what you see here is over the last 400,000 years, it's never been higher than 290 parts per million, and we're way up here, and this is how fast it's been rising. So it's pretty scary to me. Okay, now this slide here, it shows you the average temperature over the whole planet. And what it shows is that 2014 was the hottest year on record, then 2015 was the hottest year on record, then 2016 was the hottest year on record. And 2017 would have been the hottest year on record, except that 2016 was an El Nino year. And in an El Nino year, the temperature is just naturally hotter. So you can see clearly that we're just getting hotter and hotter. One of the effects of that is that they measure the amount of sea ice in the Arctic. And in 1984, it used to cover this large area here. Now, in 2016, it was down to this smaller area. And of course, people have been dreaming about being able to take ships straight across over the top. And it's now possible. In fact, in 2017, the first ship without the use of icebreakers was able to go through that Northwest Passage. So, and of course, if you look at what is predicted, it's basically, I think this is where Santa Claus lives. And so you can see in 2100, basically he will have no home. So that's a problem. Okay, now there's a lot of effects of this climate change. As you see, over most of the Arctic, the ice is over the sea. And as you know, icebergs 90% of them are underwater. So if that melts, it's not going to raise sea levels very much. But over Greenland, the ice is over land. When that melts, it all goes into the sea. Similarly in the Antarctic. When that ice and snow melts, it all goes into the sea, raising sea levels. So sea levels are rising 1.8 millimeters per year now, and we already see the direct effects of that. So a king tide is when the sun and the moon and the earth line up together, and it creates these larger tides. So whenever that happens, it turns out Miami and Miami Beach gets these floods. And it's affecting tourism substantially to the fact that Miami Beach has decided to spend $400 to $500 million of their taxpayer money for pumps to pump the seawater back, to build seawalls, and to raise their roads. So here's just one example of a project, the Indian Creek Drive in Miami Beach. They're installing new stormwater drainage systems, rebuilding the public seawall, and elevating the roadway. So those are all effects of climate change that the oil companies are not paying for. Our taxpayer dollars are going to fight these hurricanes, this king tide sea level rise, and the wildfires that we've had. So that's a cost to society. Now, again, we can see here in California that climate change is affecting us already. The California snowpack was the lowest in 500 years in 2015. Again, I talked about the hottest years. The Greenland ice sheet, they actually measure the amount of ice in the Greenland ice sheet, and it's losing 277 cubic kilometers of ice every year. And if you remember a few years ago, you couldn't eat crab because what happens is the ocean was so hot that this red algae was growing there, and it creates a toxin, domoic acid. And you'd get very sick if you ate those crabs. So they banned the harvesting of crabs. This one is particularly important to me, and I have a couple more slides on this. Fruit trees need a certain number of chill hours, and I'll talk about that later. And then again, we have sea level rise. Now, as I mentioned, the hurricanes derive their energy from the temperature of the water below them. That's why we get hurricanes in basically late summer, because the water has been heating up in the Gulf of Mexico over the whole summer, and that sea surface temperature gets hotter. And so this is a little study showing you different categories of hurricanes and what the wind speeds are, and then how much storm surge you would get for each of those categories. Now, it turns out that recent hurricanes have exceeded this 157-mile lower threshold for Hurricane 5s. So now people are talking, and if you look at it, the separation of each of these bands is about 20 miles per hour. So now we have Hurricane Patricia, which was 60 miles per hour, stronger than a Hurricane 5. So people are now talking about Category 6 hurricanes because of the rise in sea surface temperatures. Here you can see Irma had a maximum sustained wind of 185 miles per hour. So that's 30 miles over what a Category 5 starts at. So what happens is that in 1851, we had only 27 Category 4 hurricanes since that time, okay? And we've had only 3 Category 5 hurricanes in the U.S. since that time. So now we're having Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, about 10 per year. So it's increasing very dramatically, the number of hurricanes. And you can see that the sea surface temperature is rising over time. That's fueling the energy in hurricanes. So that's why we're looking at Category 6 hurricanes. Now, I'm a master gardener, so this is particularly interesting to me. It turns out that trees have this very clever way of predicting when winter is over. Let's say a tree goes dormant, drops all its leaves, and then you have a very warm week in January. Well, they may think that winter is over and they're going to start budding out. But then if you get a frost a couple of weeks later, it'll kill all the buds and the tree will not survive. So evolutionarily, they have devised this scheme where they essentially count the number of hours that it's been cold. And if they reach a certain number of hours, then they're like, okay, next time it gets warm is probably the end of winter. So different trees have evolved with different chill hours, and this is the number of hours less than 45 degrees over the winter. So Bing cherries require pretty much the most at 700 hours, and then you have different cherry trees, and then plums require fewer chill hours. So I chopped down my cherry tree, and I admit it, 2 years ago, because it was just not getting cold enough. And I'll show you this next chart, this shows you for different years the cumulative number of chill hours that you've gotten. And so 2016, it's been lower than the other previous years, but this is more telling here. So in 2017, until January 24th, we'd had only 542 chill hours. In 2012, we had 700. 2011, we had 851. And 2010, we had 595. So over time, the number of chill hours has declined. And so now farmers are looking at planting other trees. And agronomists and botanists are looking at breeding plants that require fewer chill hours. And in another group that I'm in, the California rare fruit growers, people are now looking at planting mangoes in California. So that's the state that we've gotten to. So there's, it causes, if you've noticed this, you get strange leafing out patterns. And there's this growth inhibitor that gets worn away by the cold. So if you don't get enough chill hours, you're not eating away or degrading that growth inhibitor. So when that growth inhibitor it persists in the plants, it's not going to bud out. It's not going to grow at the end of. So now the other effect that we're having is that it's getting really hot in the Middle East. I mean, we have Middle Eastern locations where it's 129 degrees. If you think of your hot water heater, most people set their hot water heater to be 120 or 125 degrees. So outside temperatures are basically the temperature that your hot water heater is running at. So heat waves in India that kill more than 100 people at a time have increased 2.5 times between 1960 and 2009. So now I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Doomsday Clock. This is released by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and they predict how close we are to basically a disaster, mostly a nuclear disaster, but actually their statement, and they just dropped it by half a minute. So it's now down to 2, which is the lowest number since 1953 in the middle of the Cold War. And what they say is it's the failure of world leaders to deal with looming threats of nuclear war and climate change. So as you probably may have heard, the US military, the Pentagon, considers climate change to be a threat multiplier. The Syrian civil war was most likely caused by a historic drought. They had a drought there. Farmers couldn't grow crops. They were starving. They moved into the cities. They started demanding services from the government. And what did the government do? They started firing on them. And so that radicalized these farmers, and they started forming militias, and that's what caused the Civil War. Then the knock-on effects of that is you have all these Syrian refugees moving into Europe that are now sort of causing all of this turmoil about Western European countries deciding what to do with these refugees. It may have caused Brexit, because Brexit says, we don't want to take all these people. Let's break away from the European Union and not have to deal with these Syrians. So those are arguments people have made about the effects of climate change on Brexit. So now this is my favorite solution to climate change. In 2007, I saw Inconvenient Truth, and I saw some of these charts, and it got me thinking very seriously about climate change. And by 2008, I said, I have to start working on this, and I retired, and I've devoted myself basically full-time to this. I actually didn't have a project in mind. I didn't really have a lot of expertise in this, but I went to the San Francisco Green Festival, and I was visiting all these tables, and one of the tables was Citizens Climate Lobby. And the executive director, Mark Reynolds, was there, and he described this concept of a revenue-neutral carbon tax, or what we prefer to call it, a carbon fee and dividend. Some people sort of reflexively shy away from the word tax. So if you mention tax, you've lost half the people. So we call it carbon fee and dividend. And the way it works is, as I said, Miami Beach is spending $500 million on adapting to climate change. They're building seawalls, raising the roads, and the three hurricanes that we had, Maria, Irma, and Harvey, cost us $300 billion. The fossil fuel companies are not paying for the damage that it was caused by those hurricanes. So that's what's called an externality. That's why we tax cigarettes heavily, because the tobacco companies don't pay for someone's lung cancer, or they didn't used to, when people got lung cancer. And so an externality is a price to society that's not reflected in the cost of the exchange between the seller and the buyer. So if you buy cigarettes from a tobacco company, your long-term medical costs are not reflected in that price. So we believe that emitting carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels creates these external costs to society, raising seawalls, wildfires, hurricanes. So we need to build that price in. And so the proposal is we would start at $15 a ton, which is equivalent to 15 cents per gallon of gasoline on all fossil fuels. So and at farthest upstream that you can. So when a lump of coal comes out of the ground, or a gallon of gasoline, a barrel of gasoline comes out at the wellhead, it's taxed right there. $15 a ton for the equivalent amount of CO2 that's burned. And then we raise it $10 a ton every year. So it starts out at $15, goes up 10 every year, very predictably. So here you can see the price just goes up in a straight line, up and up and up. Now, we have other systems. Europe had a thing called carbon, a cap and trade system. And the problem with the cap and trade system is you have a lot of price volatility. So if the economy, like during the recession, in Europe, no one was building anything, so no one was emitting carbon. So the price dropped down to $2 a ton when it started out at $30 a ton. So when you have all this price volatility, businesses don't know what they're going to be charged next year or the year after. With a very predictable rising price, businesses can plan for it. They can design their operations. They can, move off of fossil fuels. They can amortize or depreciate off their existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So We like the predictability of this versus cap and trade systems. Now, the question is, you're actually collecting hundreds of billions of dollars. So some people have proposed, well, you should use it to pay down our deficit, our federal deficit. Turns out that'll put a big drag on the economy. Our proposal is that you take every penny of it, you divide it equally among consumers, and you return it in equal checks to all consumers. The advantage of that is when a lower income person gets money, they spend it right away. So it actually stimulates the economy, it circulates in the economy. So you get actually a stimulus effect in the economy. And the other beauty of it is it's a progressive tax. Because the people with the largest carbon footprints are wealthy people that buy a lot of stuff, they own multiple houses, they fly to Europe, frequently, so they are emitting a lot of carbon, and with this tax, they're paying for every ton that they're emitting. But they're going to get the same check back, say $200 a month, that someone living in a small apartment in San Jose riding public transit. So the person with a small carbon footprint would not have paid a lot of carbon taxes, but they're going to get that same $200 a month. So the poorer people, they will get money that is basically extra money that they haven't paid into. So it becomes a progressive tax. The other question here is, let's say the US has a carbon tax, but China doesn't. The problem is that if I'm building a skyscraper and I need steel, why would I buy US steel with the carbon tax built in when I can buy Chinese steel without the carbon tax built in? So to level the playing field, we're proposing a border tariff. Means that when the Chinese steel comes in, it gets a tariff that's equivalent to what the US company had paid for the carbon. And the real beauty of that is when you impose a tariff, who keeps the money? It's the company that imposes the tariff. So when the Chinese steel comes into the United States, the US government keeps that money for the tariff. If China had the equivalent carbon tax built in, they wouldn't have to pay the tariff. Their government would keep the money from the carbon tax and recycle it to their people. So it actually encourages all the countries around the world to get their own carbon tax that's the same as ours. So it actually puts a lot of leverage on other countries to have their own carbon tax. Because why would they want to pay the tariff and give the money to the US government when they can keep it for their own people? So the advantages of this carbon tax, or carbon fee and dividend, is that it discourages bad things, just like cigarette smoking. We put large taxes on it, so we discourage smoking. This would discourage the use and burning of fossil fuels. It doesn't grow the size of government because all the money is returned back to consumers. So it's not like it's a government program. The government, decides to invest in Solyndra or invest in some, research technology. It all goes back to consumers, and let the market, it's a market-based approach. Let the market decide which technologies are going to succeed in a high carbon price economy. Again, it doesn't bet on any technologies. It encompasses all fossil fuel use. And again, it's progressive. So as I described, the cap and trade that we have here in California is very flawed, and we'd like to eventually replace it with a carbon fee and dividend. What happens is in California we give away a lot of these free permissions to burn fossil fuels for free, and we've actually given away too many of them. And in Europe they gave away way too many. So people have banked these, and now they're going to continue to burn fossil fuels. In a cap and trading system, let's say there's two companies, and one of them really reduces their carbon emissions, and they've bought permits, and they have these extra permits. And another company whose business is really booming, they need to buy a lot of permits because they're building a lot of stuff, could be steel or whatever. So they need to find the extra permits over here because there's a cap. There's only so many permits to emit fossil fuel. So since there's a cap, if I need more, I have to buy them from somebody who has extra. So Wall Street gets involved in trading these permits. And unfortunately, the way Wall Street works is they're going to sort of game it for their maximum profit. So they may hold on to them until the price gets to a very high level, and then they'll sell them. So we don't really need Wall Street to add inefficiencies to this system. Again, I talked about extreme price volatility. This actually happened. We have a cap and trade system for sulfur dioxide. If you remember, we used to have acid rain. That was caused by coal-burning power plants had a lot of sulfur in the coal. When they burned it, it created sulfur dioxide, sulfuric acid that was actually drifting on to Canada. So Canada actually sued the United States to say, you have to take care of this. So the United States created this cap and trade system. So only coal-burning power plants were emitting sulfur, so they went to all of them and said, if you want to emit a ton of sulfur, you have to buy this permit from us. And then what happened was in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit, it knocked out all the gas power plants and the gas wells. So to replace the amount of energy, electricity that was lost by knocking out gas-fired power plants, the coal plants ramped up production. So they were now emitting a lot more sulfur, but they couldn't get the sulfur permits because it was capped. So the price went up 8-fold. So you have this extreme price volatility when there's a shortage in the economy. Under the carbon fee and dividend, you can burn as much carbon dioxide as you want, just pay for it, right? So there's no cap on a company's business. So the other thing is we have this thing called offsets, which means that if I want to burn all this carbon dioxide, if I plant a bunch of trees here that are sucking carbon in, then I can get credit for that. The problem with that is when we have wildfires, all that carbon goes back in the atmosphere. So,
Wait. I saw something that said California cap. What's that? The last line.
So the California cap and trade system applies only to really large emitters. You have to emit more than 25,000 tons of CO2. So it doesn't emit smaller emitters of CO2. So with our proposal, because it's far upstream, that every source, including when you import oil into the United States, gets taxed. So it basically hits every use of fossil fuels. Does that make sense? Okay. So it turns out that we have a bunch of conservatives that agree that this is the right approach. So George Shultz says it's not a tax if the government doesn't keep the money. Okay, and Greg Mankiw says tax those things we want less of, like cigarettes and fossil fuels. So again, we talked about the cost to society. So if we do nothing, the cost is going to keep increasing as a percentage of our GDP. Eventually at 2100, it's going to get to 8% of our GDP. If we do something now, it might cost us something, but we avoid all of this extra cost due to sea level rise and having to move our cities and so on. So George Shultz and James Baker wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about how this is the right approach. It's a market-based approach. Companies, including oil companies, build in to their operations an internal carbon price. So if an oil company has the choice of drilling for new wells and they build in a $50 a ton price for carbon, maybe it's cheaper for them to start getting in the windmill business. So if they internally build in this price, they can design their operations for the future. This is the internal price that different companies have: Walt Disney, Mars, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil. So they have a built-in price already in their operations. So it turns out we can look at an example where carbon tax has worked. In 2008, British Columbia imposed a small carbon tax, and now it's ramped up to $30 a ton. Again, it's revenue neutral, so it doesn't go to new programs, it goes to reduce other taxes. And compared to the rest of Canada, their CO2 has dropped dramatically. In fact, now Canada has said every province has to have either a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. And their jobs are up. I mean, if you've been to Vancouver, it's booming. So now it's been so successful that last September they decided to increase it $5 a ton every year until it gets to $50. So unfortunately they made it no longer revenue neutral, so you can spend on measures to reduce emissions, which includes Governor Brown's high-speed rail, which is what California's cap and trade money goes into. It could go to high-speed rail, which a lot of people object to as a boondoggle. So if you return it back to everybody, it becomes a free market solution that lets the market decide what activities to engage in. So one of the things CCL did, which is we hired a very respected consulting company, Regional Economic Models Incorporated, and they looked at this proposal in 2014, and what they did was they confirmed that it would actually grow 2.8 million jobs over business as usual in the economy. And the reason is the fossil fuel industry is very capital intensive. If you're building an oil rig, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars. But if you're and you only have like 11 people working on the rig. But if you put in solar, it's very labor intensive. So you're actually hiring a lot of people. So it turns out that you're trading off the very capital intensive for a labor intensive solution. It turns out that this carbon fee and dividend would reduce CO2 emissions by 50% over business as usual in 20 years. So we'd grow jobs by 2.8 million in 20 years. This is the expected dividend over time. It'll actually get up to $400 per month for a family of 4. And then you'd save lives, because 1/5 of the kids in the Central Valley have asthma. And that's due to diesel emissions and dust and other things, but a lot of it is due to fossil fuel emissions. And if you look at, in India, about 2.5 million people are dying every year due to pollution, due to air pollution. So this is per region, so you would actually save cumulatively 250,000 lives. So it's a win-win. You know, it's a market-based solution, increases employment. A lot of naysayers have said, well, if you impose these taxes, you're going to cut jobs, you're going to kill jobs in the coal and gas industry. Well, you might, but you'd grow jobs elsewhere. It reduces carbon dioxide. It's fiscally responsible. It increases incomes for the lower 2/3 of income categories. So their incomes will increase. It saves lives, and it adds 1.3 trillion to the GDP, because when you give money back to low-income people, they spend it, and it recycles in the economy. So it turns out that Citizens Climate Lobby has been working on this for almost 10 years, and they haven't gotten anywhere in Congress. So they said, how do we get bipartisan support? So they created this thing called the Climate Solutions Caucus, and it started when we started working with the mayors of Florida cities, because the congresspeople in Florida weren't doing anything about climate change. They were deniers. So we got the mayors saying, hey, our cities are being flooded every king tide. Why don't you come take a look at this? They started talking to their congresspeople, and those conservative congresspeople formed this thing called the Climate Solutions Caucus, which members of Congress have to join in pairs. So if you're a Democrat wanting to join this caucus, it's up to 33 Republicans. This is old. We're up to 33 Republicans and 33 Democrats. if a Democrat wants to join, he or she has to find a Republican to join with him or her. They have very regular hearings on the impact of climate change to the ski industry, to the fishing industry, to different industries, the forest industry. So here's some good news. In addition to this carbon tax that we're proposing, the economy is already moving to decarbonize, okay? Wind prices have declined by 66% over the last 7 years. Solar prices have declined 85% over the last 7 years. This is from the National Renewable Energy Lab, and it shows the decline in prices for residential photovoltaic, commercial photovoltaic, utility scale. Utility scale has gone down by 78%. According.
Are you going to allow time for questions?
Oh yeah, sorry. Did I have until 12:15 to go, or?
4 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Well, if
All
you're
right.
going to have any questions,
Yeah.
at 12:15, there will be no time for questions.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to go to 12:15. I'm basically done. Yeah. So battery prices have gone down 82% over 15 years. I'm not going to show this, but it shows the levelized cost of electricity, that photovoltaics is now cheaper than coal. And this is an interesting curve. In California, actually in the whole U.S., most of our CO2 emissions were caused by the generating electricity. That's been declining. And so now the transportation industry has crossed, and we're now using more CO2 for transportation. Thank you. Sorry I went over.
Okay. Well, first of all, you know, I'm very up on this technology, and 2/3 of what you said is scientifically wrong.
Okay.
But there is a global warming problem, you know, and a carbon problem that we need to address. Wouldn't it makes more sense, rather than a carbon tax, which just makes carbon more expensive, to and I think there could be a role for a carbon tax if you use the money to subsidize solar and wind and new technology research to replace carbon, because everybody still needs energy. But you know, wouldn't it make more sense just to buy an electric car, put solar panels on your house, and you know, put a battery pack on your house, and do the things that actually replace carbon, you know, rather than just tax it?
So basically, this is not a tax that grows government. This is a tax just like cigarettes that puts an extra price on things that we believe are bad for our planet. Now, you can say, why don't you just buy an electric car? But electric cars are more expensive. Okay? So who can afford an electric car? That's what the car manufacturers are saying. So, you know, if you buy a boat.
Subsidizing with the tax.
Well, so the problem is that we're looking for a market-based approach. If the government decides how much the subsidies are going to be, or the government decides that we're going to pay for insulation of your house, or we're going to pay for, that becomes the government has to administer that. There could be waste in that system. So there's a lot of conservatives, including George Shultz and Jim Baker, that say, we don't want to grow government. If we grow government, then, you know...
Isn't the important thing taking the carbon out of the air? So if you're subsidizing insulation and electric cars and things that actually do replace carbon, wouldn't that make more sense? If
So-
you're actually going to try to get carbon reduced.
So I actually believe in that. I'm progressive, and I believe that government is a force for good. A lot of the research that government does helps our health and our environment, but there are a lot of people that are trying to reduce the size of government. Look at all the things that are happening right now. They want to kill the government because they don't believe the government can do anything right. So now you have this partisanship in Congress that's stopping anything from happening. So we want to bring along conservatives and progressives to a solution that would actually work. It would get us to, I mean, based on regional economic modeling, which does a lot of the modeling for McKinsey, the consulting company McKinsey. They're very respected. They said we'd get to 50% reductions in carbon in 20 years with this. Yes.
So my question is, I think, I wonder if you're not underestimating a lot of the costs and the damage from climate change. I guess maybe I'm coming at it from sort of the opposite point of view. In addition to sea level rises and storms and things like that, there are changes in monsoonal patterns and loss of glaciers and things like that that cause huge catastrophic, changes to the way populations like feed themselves.
Yeah.
Less than 4 feet of sea level rise would cause like 40 to 50% of Bangladesh to have to displace, for instance.
That's exactly right.
And
yeah.
so I'm just kind of wondering whether everything's being a little bit underestimated when you hand all the money back to the people. Who pays for that kind of cost? Those are extremely huge costs that are, as we've seen from the migration debate over the last few years, very few people really want to pay for.
Well, I agree. In fact, the U.S. government uses the social cost of carbon to be $46. California only prices carbon at $15 right now. So we're lowballing everything. If you look at the IPCC, all of their estimates have always been lowball estimates because it's a political process. You have to get all the countries to agree, including Saudi Arabia. So, yes. There's one right here.
I have. Last week there was a meeting in Cupertino on climate, which was entitled "A Conversation with Your Assemblyman."
I was there.
You were there.
Yeah.
Well, I had asked a question, and it was the only question, as I recall, about why the assemblyman had talked about cap and trade and had not mentioned at all the possibility of the carbon tax and dividend. And both Evan Lowe and Mark Berman essentially said they'd never heard of that. How can that be, Jain?
I was actually surprised that they said that because Senator Wojciechowski in SB 775, he proposed a carbon tax solution pretty similar to what we were looking for. Unfortunately, Jerry Brown, who needed 2/3 of a majority to get his extension of cap and trade to 2030 passed, he worked closely with oil companies behind closed doors to get something that was acceptable to everybody. So it's the whole sausage-making part of politics that he was able to get something, because cap and trade has been challenged. The current cap and trade has been challenged as being a tax. If you impose a tax, you need a 2/3 majority. So Jerry Brown, who's a very astute politician, was able to get something by working with the oil companies. And we're happy to have something than nothing.
Is there any way CCL can put more pressure on Jerry Brown and on the assemblyman, inform the assemblyman more about the carbon tax and possibilities of changing California's cap and trade to a carbon tax?
We have been working on it. In fact, California a couple of years passed a thing called Assembly Joint Resolution 43, AJR 43, which recommends to the U.S. government to pass a carbon tax. Okay. The problem is that these border adjustments can really only be done at the federal level. So it's far more efficient to have a national carbon tax than a statewide carbon tax. But that's what CCL does. In the past, we've worked mostly nationally. So we meet very regularly, probably once a quarter, with Zoe Lofgren, Ro Khanna, Jimmy Panetta, Jackie Spear, all of the local, Anna Eshoo. In fact, Anna Eshoo is in the Climate Solutions Caucus already.
Nice.
And Zoe Lofgren and Ro Khanna are on the waiting list to get in. So we work very closely with them. We meet with them regularly. But we've just only recently started working more at the state level because our president accept this and has pulled out of Paris. So now we think the states have to get this done and push the feds.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, the one in the back.
You mentioned very quickly the Canadian approach
Yeah.
is Jerry Brown's approach, right?
No, Jerry,
It's not, it's
the
what
Canadian,
you're proposing.
so British Columbia has had a straight carbon tax.
Yeah.
That means every ton of CO2 emitted gets taxed.
And it's going
Okay.
back to lower the Canadian national debt.
The
Just the
current tax,
reverse of what you suggested.
I believe the current tax does not go to reverse the, to
Well,
reduce
that's
the.
what you said.
I don't think I did. It goes to reduce other taxes.
Well, same difference.
No, no. It's reducing payroll taxes, it's reducing other taxes.
okay.
It's not going to the debt.
All right, you didn't
Yeah.
make that one clear.
Okay, sorry.
So, your proposal, though, is very broad. What do you think the chances are of that becoming law in the next 25 years?
It depends on how bad the Hurricane Sixes get.
Okay, very good. You've really convinced me that this is a good approach. But I had a question about a detail. I think you said that carbon coming into the country will be subject to a tariff, except if the country sending it also has a similar sort of
Correct.
fee, right?
Yeah.
So imagine for a moment that I'm a Saudi prince.
Yeah.
I know I don't look like one, but imagine. And so we're bringing Saudi oil into the U.S. It's subject to this tariff, unless I institute a tax. Now, you said it was 13 cents a gallon to gas. That's about $6 to $10 a barrel of oil. Barrels of oil are a lot more than that. The Saudis make a whole lot more profit on that. So the Saudis say, okay, fine, we'll institute this $6 tax. It goes straight to the Saudi pocket. Is there any requirement that they redistribute this to the people, or
No,
do
they-
they just have to put a $6 per barrel tax on there?
That is more complicated than, because every country is going to do it a different way, and some countries are corrupt and they're going to hide it, and all of this stuff. But that happens with our trade right now. We just had this big solar tariff go in, right? So now we're charging 30% more for solar panels coming to the United States because China basically gave all their solar companies these zero-interest loans and gave them all this land and helped them build these solar companies. It's very difficult for us to track everything that's happening, but we would love it if every country said we're returning all the money back to consumers.
As long as they tax it, then they would be able to ship it tariff-free.
So yes, so what happens is, right now, let's say oil is coming in at $60 a barrel. If we put a $15 a ton tax on it, we should be expecting to pay $75 a ton. Well, it's a ton, it's not a barrel, but we'd be paying more for that oil than we ordinarily would, and that would build in that price. So that means the consumers have a choice. If you're going to drive your gas car at $75 a barrel versus an electric car, you're going to choose the electric car. Yes.
If I may answer that question simply, the whole purpose of the tariff is so that a barrel from Saudi Arabia costs the same as a barrel from North Dakota. And as long as they cost the same, then our society will make the right decisions to go to electric vehicles or whatever. How they administer their tax on that end is completely irrelevant.
That's true, yeah.
What about overpopulation demanding more power and energy in fossil fuels? You have to bring the population into this. We're talking about 9 billion people in a couple of years.
So it turns out the most effective way to control population is education of women. And so we really have to work on educating women. And there's a fellow named Paul Hawken who wrote a book called Drawdown, and he listed the top 100 things that you could do to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I think number 3 on that list was educating women.
I'm glad I will be gone.
But you have kids and grandkids.
That's their problem.
I don't know, I pay an insane amount of money for my son to go to University of Chicago, and I only do that to guarantee him a good future. And if I'm not leaving him a good future, I don't know what I can do.
Okay, so the whole point of this is to reduce emissions of
Yes, correct.
greenhouse gases. But
Yeah.
my question is that is it enough, in your opinion, to prevent a catastrophic climate change, or we need something extra like extraction of already existing carbon dioxide from atmosphere and ocean, or things like this?
Correct. So the thing is that we've emitted carbon dioxide. The temperature of the planet has increased by 1 degree Celsius already. The amount of CO2 that we've put in the atmosphere will continue to trap heat for another 300-400 years. So we've already baked in a 1.5 degree Celsius temperature rise. Some scientists say that's already too much. We shouldn't go past 1.5 degrees. Other scientists say, well, we can go to 2 degrees. So the question is that in order to stay below 2 degrees, according to Bill McKibben and his work, which was in 2012, he said we could only burn 565 billion tons of CO2. We're emitting 35 billion tons per year. If you divide 35 into 565, you come up with 17 years. So if we're not off of fossil fuels completely in 17 years, and this was 5 years ago, so now we have 12 years left. So, you know, it is scary, and I firmly believe at some point we're going to have to start sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and mineralizing it, combining it with minerals like calcium to get rid of it. Now, I'm actually also working on a project that makes clouds brighter, so that would reflect sunlight back into space and avert some of this extra energy that we're putting on the planet. The problem is the CO2 in the atmosphere dissolves into the oceans, causing ocean acidification. So our solution cools the planet but doesn't take care of acidification. So while we're working on this, we don't actually ever want to see it deployed because of acidification. So it's one of those things that you can get into sort of a Malthusian argument where at some point he said that everyone's going to die because we don't have enough food, right? But we're pretty smart humans, and we can get solar energy costs down, we can build batteries, we can do things. You know, you have to have hope or you can't get through the next day.
All right, that's all the time we have for Q&A. Let's thank Suds for a great talk.